我们继续跟瑞凯德教授来做访谈。瑞凯德教授9号要在龙应台基金会所举办的台北沙龙，做一场专题演讲。Professor Richburg, I'd like to ask you about, in detail in this section, about Chinese politics and its policy. You were based in China right at the time Xi Jinping is getting in power, and you wrote about Bo Xilai at the time. It's very intriguing, the Chinese politics. From your experience then and now you're based in Hong Kong, how can we really understand Chinese politics? And it's very opaque. Some people are saying that it's even more opaque than the Soviet politics during the time. And your comment is?
Chinese politics is a real black box. It's really difficult to figure out what was going on. I just recently went back and looked at some of my own reporting and some of the other reporting from 2011, 2012, leading up to the 18th Party Congress, 十八大, when Xi Jinping came in. It was fascinating that a couple of things. First of all, this was the heyday of open internet in China. Weibo had really taken off. And the Chinese government censors hadn't quite figured out yet how to control it. So we were learning all of these things about what was going on behind the scenes and what was going on with Bo Xilai, the murder of the British businessman down in Chongqing. This was all coming out on the internet. There were a lot of stories coming out that we followed through the internet at the time. Chen Guangcheng, the blind activist, escaped, and the Chinese tried to suppress it officially, but we were reading all of this stuff coming out on the internet. A lot of it was coming through Hong Kong. Hong Kong media was reporting some of this first, so we all had to check out what the Hong Kong papers were doing.
Of course, you realize some of the rumor is sending by the opposite camp.
Absolutely. What happened was you had factions going on, and I know that in Beijing they hate to say that there are factions, but you had factions, and each one were leaking stories about the other to the Hong Kong media that the one was going off through Weibo and getting passed around. So it was an incredible period, but we got a little bit of a view of what was going on the inside because there was turmoil. And I think people now recognize Xi Jinping has come out later in some of his speeches and talked about a coup. He used the word coup that was going, or attempted going on during that period. Now, I think that was why that whole period, 2011, 2012, so start with the Arab Spring and these calls for a Jasmine revolution in China that never really took off, and take that through the 18th Party Congress. That was the period when they decided they really needed to crack down and control the internet. And that's when these rules started coming in on real name registration, making platforms liable for what was published, making it illegal to incite. That's when they started shutting down websites, arresting bloggers, arresting people for what they put on, and really deciding that this internet had become kind of a wild west that they couldn't control. But so now it's a much more difficult to figure out what's going on in Chinese politics. People are really afraid to talk. People who I talk to on a regular basis now would just never even see me if I'm back in China. They just say, 不方便. It's just not convenient at the moment to talk to, especially talking to foreigners. The foreign journalists who are based there say the reporting atmosphere has shrunk. We used to talk to a lot of people outside the party, retired officials, for example, or academics who would talk to us. The space is really getting tighter and tighter for reporting there. And even you're seeing less of it in these Hong Kong papers now as well.
It's interesting because when you are in Beijing, it's the golden period for reporting because it is in power rivalry that Xi Jinping haven't really consolidated its power. But now, even after 5 years, Xi Jinping already consolidated its power. There's still rumor going on, especially in early July. There's rumor that some of the party elders try to contain the power of Xi Jinping. The rumor especially mentioned about how resentful the party member is about abolishing the term limit for the state president. And then you have the rivalry between trade between China and the United States. How do you come, you're thinking on this?
Well, it's interesting that we're starting to see little bubbling up of dissent. And I say bubbling up because it's not widespread at all. It's only little signs here and there. We're not back to that kind of golden age of reporting that we were in 2011, 2012. But it's interesting, since Xi Jinping has decided that he can stay forever, abolishing the term limits, seems to have started a little bit of a pushback. And one of the problems with being president for life, if that's what he plans, is that, I've covered a lot of presidents for life when they've fallen. Nobody dies in office as president for life. I mean, go ask President Suharto, go ask Marcos, go ask Mobutu Sese Seko. I've covered all of them. All of these presidents for life eventually get pushed out. What happens is when you declare all power to yourself, or you're the center, or you're the core, as it's called, all problems come to you. But now you've got the economy starting to slow down a little bit. You had this vaccine scandal.
Right.
So everybody now can focus their criticisms on one person, and that's the person who declared themselves the core of everything, and the guy who can stay there for a long time. And don't forget, there are a lot of ambitious people who want to move up in the ranks. In the past, you only had to wait 2 terms before you knew the guy on top would leave, and then his cadre of people would retire with him, and then your group can move up. If someone now declares they're not going anywhere, the ambitious people may not decide it's time to wait. Maybe they'll start pushing a little bit firmer. So you got slowing economy, things like the vaccine scandal, stock market going down, and the guy in charge saying, basically, I'm not planning on going anywhere. That's not a good combination.
I'll move to Chinese policy, especially your topic in the Taipei Salon will be on China policy in Africa. It is a perfect timing since they just have the China-African Cooperation Forum. And Xi Jinping had announced is going to donate another extra 60 billion to African development. Why China is doing it? Why China is so generous in a sense? Is it for China's own interests, or it's a mutually beneficial thing?
Well, I think every country does everything in its own interest, and we have to go look. We have to parse that out, and it's really difficult because you get these announcements from China, and it takes some time to parse it out. How much of this new 60 billion is really aid versus loans versus credit versus concessionary loans? Even when it's credit, it has to be used only for Chinese equipment and Chinese companies. So obviously, it's to benefit China. China had an excess. They have an excess of labor. They have an excess of steel. The Chinese economy is slowing down. So building infrastructure in Africa and in Southeast Asia, and for the Belt and Road Initiative, building infrastructure outside of China is a way to keep employment going, to keep the steel mills running, et cetera. Interestingly, and this kind of goes back to our previous conversation about the kind of little dissent we're seeing bubbling up. After this announcement of the new $60 billion for Africa, some Chinese netizens were online saying, hey, hold on a second, why aren't you spending that money here in China? And they have actually had to crush that kind of comment along the internet here. So the question, it's definitely benefiting China at a time when the Chinese economy is slowing down. The question is Africa really benefiting? And I think the answer is, critics, especially from the U.S. administration, have been saying this is a debt trap. They're going to get into, these African countries are going to get into debt to China. They can't repay it. They're going to have to end up, giving away strategic assets to pay this debt. Some others in some of the African leaders are saying this is great. They're doing what the West never did, which is build infrastructure and invest. I'm somewhere in the middle. I think, yes, this is good for African countries. If China is going, they're building roads. They built the railroad from Kenya to Mombasa. They're building things that are lasting. The infrastructure stays there in Africa. That's a good thing. They have to be wary of debt. They have to be wary that the Chinese companies don't always come with a socially active viewpoint. They're not looking at environmental issues. They're not consulting the population on some of these issues. And we've seen in Zimbabwe, leadership can change pretty quickly in Africa. And when it does, the people may be not too happy about projects that were approved under the old leadership. I saw that happen in the 90s in Africa. I saw it happen in Indonesia here closer to home, where the government falls and the people are saying to, at that point, the West, the World Bank, saying, hey, wait a minute, why should we pay these loans back for these projects that we never wanted and we, the people, never had any say in? So I think that's one thing that we have to be wary of, that the people don't always have buy-in for some of these big infrastructure projects. But overall, I think it's good. I mean, there's something like 10,000 African Chinese companies operating in Africa. Not all of them are the big state-owned enterprises. In fact, most are mom and pop companies, small companies, and they are employing local people. They are giving jobs. There's something like 1 million people being employed now because of these small and medium-sized enterprises, just mom and pop companies operating there. A lot of them are trade, a lot of them are small-scale manufacturing. But the African economies are going up. Now we have to remember that these are only a few countries that they're really operating in. They're not all over the continent. They're mostly Kenya, Ethiopia, Sudan, a few in Zambia. South Africa is huge. Nigeria is huge. It's not spread evenly across the continent. So Africa's got 50-some countries there.
You just mentioned some of the African people, they think that China is doing differently than what the West used to do. My question is on a thing people talk about China model, that people talk about the Beijing consensus has really overpowering the Washington consensus. But now, do you see that African countries still look up the China model as a way of alternative for them? Or how about the Asian countries see the China model? Do you think that can still stand?
Well, that's a great question. Look, I think some of the African leaders, like some of the Asian leaders, look to China as a place that can grow economically under a single-party state or a single-party dictatorship. And you can have kind of tight political control, but still have pretty impressive economic growth. You don't need to have a democratic system. You don't hear a lot of people saying that. People on the ground still want to say in their own government. This kind of idea, and I heard this in the 90s, there was this great Asian values debate where people were going around saying, Asian countries are different. We want a strong paternalistic leader and strong growth. And for a while, that worked in countries like Indonesia that were growing, under the Suharto dictatorship. After a while, that falls apart because, as people get richer, they want a bit more of a say in how they run things themselves. And the Asian values debate in the 90s was never kind of that widespread because you had democratic countries. You still had Taiwan, you still had South Korea, you still had the Philippines after Marcos had become a democracy. So I think that's always been Asian leaders who are looking for a model like that. So sure, Hun Sen in Cambodia would look to China as a new model for leadership. If you ask the Cambodian people, I'm sure they don't see China as a big model for leadership. I think the thing about China, which is fascinating to me, is if you go around the world, including Africa, Middle Eastern countries, Central Asia, everybody wants China's money. China is the rich country now. They're, as America pulls back in retreat under America First, China is the big gorilla in the world now on the world stage. Everybody wants China's money. Not that many people want to be like the Chinese in their political system. So they'll take their money, but they don't necessarily want to, send their kids there to go to university or emulate their political system. So China's still got a problem with their soft power. They've got money power, but that's about it, I would think, at the moment. They're trying to change that. They've got these Confucian centers, the media operations are opening all over Africa, but still, I think people make a distinction between China's money and want to follow the Chinese model.
My question is still, after China committed its money, would China restrain itself or restrain its influence in those countries? What I'm asking is, China don't want to be like the old imperialists, but somehow they still want to exert their influence. Like the case, especially I'd like to ask you about Zimbabwe. Just before the coup, the military leader had a Beijing visit. Some people are rumored that it's China who have been consenting of this coup plan. What's your thinking about Chinese influence in Africa? Is the case of Zimbabwe will be happening, will repeating itself in other countries?
Yeah, I don't think so. And again, we don't know what happened between the new president of Zimbabwe when he was in China before that coup. We don't know what was said. We'd have to be a fly on the wall there. But the difference between China and the imperial Western countries before was China never was out to colonize countries in Africa. They don't want any permanent colonies, I think, there. What they would like to do is inject this new term we're hearing is sharp power. They want to inject their ideas and have people supporting their points of view. you're starting to see that in Western countries like Australia, where they're starting especially to use the Chinese students associations in these countries to try to make people, for example, not refer to Taiwan as a country. You're starting to see even in the U.S., they're starting to use these student organizations and these Confucian institutes as almost kind of a new column out there to push China's view on things, so that if a professor in a classroom in Texas says something that's deemed anti-China, he'll suddenly find himself under attack. And so I think that's what China is trying to do, is sort of, in some ways, force the rest of the world to use its terminology and its lexicon. I mean, imagine they're forcing United Airlines and Marriott Hotel not to list Taiwan in a drop-down tab where it says countries where we fly. But these are minor things to some of us, but the Chinese are actually pushing all of these buttons and using its economic clout to say, you want to do business with us, you have to follow what we say, you have to use our terminology, you have to use our lexicon. You can't say Hong Kong as a country, you can't say Taiwan as a country. And a lot of people are starting to fall for this. China's just too big to ignore in the world. That's what I see going on at the moment. So in terms of actual, getting involved and intervening in countries and toppling governments the way some of the West did in the past, when the U.S. is responsible for a lot of this, I don't see China going down that far path. They want to deal with whoever happens to be in place at the time, and they'll quickly switch sides and deal with whoever takes over.
My final question is also following on the sharp power thing. The Australia you mentioned had come up with the Foreign Influence Act. And I think in Taiwan, we are also very aware about it's an open democracy. We are always subject to there's outside influence or even a penetration or subversion of our system. But somehow we have to balance on our own democratic and liberal value in order to counter this. So how can we do that? I mean, when we face with China, such a big power like in Taiwan?
It's a really interesting question. It's a big dilemma that's facing not only Taiwan but other countries. I spent a couple weeks this summer in Ukraine looking around, and the Ukraine, it's a relatively big country but small population next to Russia. And they complain about the disinformation campaign and how Russian disinformation and lies are infiltrating their political system there. There's a war going on in eastern Ukraine. The Russians have invaded, basically. But according to the propaganda, these are patriotic Russians who are rising up because they want to join the motherland. And it's they kind of ignored this for a while, but now they're recognizing that this actually is an insidious new way for countries to exert their influence, this kind of really sharp power, in addition in the Ukraine situation, the military power. Taiwan, you can also look to the United States and how we're now dealing with our democracy is being attacked. We're being attacked by Russian trolls, some of these guys sitting in basements somewhere who are just sending out disinformation. They've actually organized real rallies in the United States with fake websites. And so it's a really tough question that an open democracy has to face when there are insidious actors around the world who are willing to use that very openness to try to subvert it. And I think we're just trying to figure it out now in the U.S. They're holding hearings in the Congress as we speak to try to think of what regulations should we put on foreign powers coming in and using the internet to try to subvert our democracy. Taiwan has a big problem here because you're right next to China. China's there. They've got an interest in coming in and having you merge and become officially a part of China. And so, yes, they are using probably every means at their disposal. And when you've got an open democratic system, your tools are limited. You don't want to go back to being a dictatorship to kind of keep out this kind of insidious disinformation coming in. So that's a huge problem, and I think it's a problem facing all democracies, including in Western Europe, where the Russians are there trying to subvert democracies. We've not seen anything like this before. And so I think democratic countries are going to have to together figure out ways to kind of combat this. It's also going to be up to citizens in these countries to kind of be able to recognize what's the insidious propaganda, the pernicious, dangerous disinformation coming in, versus what's real information. So, news literacy on the part of populations is going to be incredibly important. I think all governments in Western democracies need to be investing in news literacy so populations can know when they're looking at something or reading something or seeing something that this is fake news.
Thank you very much, Professor Richburg,
Well, thank you.
to be sharing your thought with our viewers.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting for me to be here.
谢谢您的收看，我们下次见。